Our speaker this afternoon is Joseph Choonara, who's the author of a Reader's Guide to Marxist Capital, which you can find at the back and also obviously in bookmarks on the first floor. Joseph is going to speak for about 35 minutes, after which time there'll be plenty of time for discussions and contributions. So I'll ask Joe to kick us off.
Yeah, I was casting my mind back today to a year ago, and it seems like an extraordinary long time ago, I have to say. But if you do cast your mind back, you'll remember that on the left generally, there was a certain air of miserableism in the wake of the referendum. There was a picture that Britain was moving inexorably further and further to the right, that Brexit would lead to horror, and those of us, the minority of us on the left, who argued for a left-wing Brexit, a Lexit position, would be proved horribly wrong. It was captured very well in an academic article by someone called Owen Worth, which I assume was written some time ago, but it had the misfortune to appear a week ago. And Owen Worth writes this: when we witness the fallout from the Corbyn opposition since the referendum, seen with his decline in popularity, continuing division over his leadership within the Labour Party, and the inability to forge a coherent post-Brexit strategy, this leads us to conclude that far from escaping the structural confines of European capitalism, Brexit has left us further behind when it comes to the potential for socialist renewal. That was a dominant perspective, I think, for much of the left in the wake of the referendum. Now, I want to start, this is not about gloating. I'm going to gloat a little bit. But it's not a meeting about gloating, believe me when I say that. And I'll explain why in a moment. But let me just say, we had a very different view of the referendum. This is what I wrote actually 4 months before the referendum in the pamphlet that I wrote for the SWP. I wrote this: we cannot assume that the right and the racist will be the beneficiaries of a vote to break with the EU. If Cameron were to become the Prime Minister who allowed EU membership, one of the main planks of British capitalist policy, to crumble, could he survive in office? And if his government fell, is it inevitable that what would come next would be a government further to the right? Or might we see an opportunity for a Corbyn-led Labour government, something we would welcome as creating a greater space in British society to advance left arguments? Now, regardless of the detail of the argument, in terms of the broad line of march, the analysis we put forward, I think, has been confirmed by the last 12 months. And we have to remember the earth-shattering significance of what happened on the 8th of June 2017. Start with an argument that I have heard all my life. And the argument is this. The argument is that in British society, socialist ideas can never be popular. And what the 8th of June showed is that not only can socialist ideas be popular, socialist ideas are wildly popular in British society, because the Labour Party, standing in relative terms on probably the most left-wing platform compared to the political mainstream for 30 or 40 years, achieved the biggest swing to Labour since 1945. A tremendous shift in the political landscape. A second thing that I've been told all my life: young people are apathetic. Young people turned out in their tens and hundreds of thousands to not just vote for Corbyn, but to go out and campaign and fight for a Corbyn victory. No one can say now that young people are apathetic in British society. But the third thing that people say is that Britain will move inevitably to the right. And again, the logic of this has been blown out of the water by the results on the 8th of June. And it's worth remembering, had the election result gone the referendum result gone the other way, we wouldn't have been facing a general election this year. We'd be facing David Cameron, still ensconced in Downing Street, George Osborne next door, still pushing austerity rather than playing the much more useful function of writing editorials attacking Teresa May in the office of the Evening Standard. Now, as I say, the point here is not to gloat about who was right and who was wrong. The point is to say that we have argued throughout that the left do not have to be passive observers of an unstoppable catastrophe, that we can play a role in shaping the situation, and that's the real lesson that we have to take forward in the period ahead. I want to start by setting out some of the political terrain in which Brexit is taking place, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what the left, I think, has to do. The first thing I want to say is that the Tory crisis over Brexit is only just beginning. Think about the rows that are taking place in the cabinet. And one of the features of the weakness of Theresa May is you get these extraordinary comments, quotations and so on coming from the heart of Westminster, just quoted glibly in the mainstream press at the moment. I'm going to give you a sense of what it's like in the cabinet. But the backdrop to this is that there is a war going on in the cabinet. On the one hand, you have David Davis, the Brexit secretary, who's at war with Philip Hammond, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And Davis wants a clean break with the European Union at any price, and is backed by Boris Johnson and Liam Fox, whereas Philip Hammond wants a more cautious transitional period and supported by Amber Rudd and Damien Green. This is a major conflict running through the heart of government at the moment. And it's not just a two-way conflict. Boris Johnson, it's said, has his own independent view, although no one quite knows what it is, including Boris Johnson. And he was so confused that he organised a get-together. They had tents, apparently, in his garden the Sunday before last. And this is one of the quotes from someone who's present. It said, the tricky part is pinning him down on detail. You think you are hashing out the views on the rights of EU citizens, and suddenly you realise he's rushing off to get some more marinade for the barbecue. This is a picture of how the government works in Britain today. There's also a row over Boris Johnson's... Boris Johnson's a very easy target, but forgive me if I take advantage of that. There's also a row over Boris Johnson's famous claim that his strategy around Brexit is have cake and eat it. Philip Hammond replies he wants more cake for everybody. This is his bold strategy. And another Tory MP said this: it's very hard to see a compromise. It's a black forest at the moment. So, we may not like the Tories, but they have great jokes sometimes. But this is a picture of chaos and instability. Now, does anyone think that adding the ingredient to the DUP, the political wing of a series of armed loyalist terror groups, is going to add stability to this situation? Absolutely not. This is a very, very unstable, divided government. Chaos reigns in Westminster. Here's another quote that appeared in the Financial Times about Theresa May and her sort of lacklustre, confused situation at the top of this insanity. Theresa May has to ring Laura Kuenssberg at the BBC each night just to find out what her government has done that day. And knowing Laura Kuenssberg, this is probably accurate. Probably does tell Theresa May what her government has done. Anyway, the weakness of the Tory government is reflected in the sheer number of retreats and U-turns it's had to make. Extraordinary U-turns. Think about the Queen's speech and think about what the Tories were threatening. Remember the plan to allow more grammar schools? Gone. Remember the heated arguments about Donald Trump's state visits? What's happened to it? Not mentioned in the Queen's speech. Remember the promise to give a free vote on fox hunting? Disappeared. The foxes are safe. Badgers next. Now we have to rescue the badgers. Scrapping there's a badger fan there somewhere. Scrapping the triple lock on pensions, it's gone. The public sector pay freeze, a central pillar of Tory policy since David Cameron Osborne took over. U-turn on the policy, then a U-turn on a U-turn. Now it looks like there might be a U-turn on a U-turn on a U-turn. She's sort of spinning so fast she's going to burrow into the earth at this rate. And the reality is that every vote in Parliament in the current situation, a minority government, risks a rebellion. So when they invited the DUP into government, into supporting the government, what do they have to do? They have to make a massive retreat, and it's a big victory, of allowing women from Northern Ireland to get abortions freely in British society. It's a victory, but it shows the weakness of the government. They didn't think they could win a vote on this question in the House of Commons, and so they were forced to back down. That's a good situation to be in, a situation of weakness and fragility at the top. Remember the arguments about the strong, stable government? This is not a strong and stable government. Now, the second point about this I want to make is this. This is as good as it gets for Theresa May, because the talks on Brexit have not even started yet. At the moment we're in talks about talks. And before they can even get to the talks about Brexit, they have to agree a deal on EU citizens, and they have to agree a deal on the bill that Britain has to pay in order to leave the European Union. and having whipped up a climate of xenophobia and nationalism, how is Theresa May going to sell to Tory backbenchers the idea of a €100 billion leaving bill to exit the European Union? This is going to be a source of greater conflict, tension on the Tory backbenchers and in the House of Commons. The talks proper, assuming we can get through all that, won't start until October. They won't start until the German elections are out of the way. And let's think what that means. In reality, it means that there'll be 1 year to conclude one of the most fiendish negotiations that has ever taken. I mean, Brest-Litovsk peace, vanishes into the shade compared to the complexity of this negotiation. How are they possibly going to do this in a year? To give you a sense of the difficulty, the CBI estimates that if they break with the EU institutions, they'll have to create 34 new regulatory bodies in Britain just to oversee the legislation. There's a particularly vexatious argument, by the way, happening at the moment about the export and import of bull semen. And one of the crucial questions is whether the bull ejaculated before or after March 2019, because it makes a difference, apparently. But it gives some sense of the complexity of these negotiations. But to be serious about it, if you look at the language coming out of the European Union, the idea that Britain is going to get an easy ride because Germany happens to export things to Britain, think again. In many ways, politics is in the driving seat in these negotiations, and the European Union has every interest in punishing Britain for breaking with the European Union and breaking with the single market. These are not going to be easy negotiations. They're going to be very difficult indeed. And just to add something to that, you see, it's not just contentious within the Tory cabinet and contentious between the Tory cabinet and Brussels. What's happening as well is also a major clash that's taking place between the leadership of the Conservative Party and the leading elements of British capitalism, the corporations and banks. And this is the backdrop to all this. Remember that the overwhelming majority of multinationals and capitalist institutions the world over back to the hilt a Remain vote in the referendum. We have to remember that. And overwhelmingly, the multinationals want now to remain part of the single market. And they feel they're losing a grip on the situation. There's one FTSE 100 chairman who's quoted in spring saying there's frustration and sadness and suddenly this feeling of a huge gulf between business and key decision makers. Another business lobbyist says this: we've gone from the throne room to the naughty step. Even when I talk to Philip Hammond or other people in the Treasury, I don't feel the message is getting through to the real decision makers. And on Friday, the CBI, the sort of bosses' union, if you like, called for an indefinite transitional period of effective British membership of the single market. This is not going to happen. And so there's this huge clash taking place between the Tories, the traditional party of big business, and the actual real interests of big business. And this is the backdrop to these kind of debates that are taking place within the cabinet. Essentially, May has sought to hold on to office by partially breaking with the interests of capital, at least rhetorically criticising neoliberalism and the free market, even though she backs many of these things, and it's creating another tension between the capitalists and the wider ruling class. Now that's the background. Why is this so important? Because whenever you have cracks at the top of society, it creates a space for those of us at the bottom of society to begin to advance our own demands and put forward our own positions. And it's a context of weakness for the ruling class, not a context of ruling class strength. We have to remember that when we're putting forward our arguments. What should we be arguing as a left in this chaotic context? Let me first of all say that one absolute non-starter is for the left to argue for a reversal of Brexit. And I want to explain why. You see, first of all, it's wrong for us in principle. When we talk about the European Union, we go back to what we said in the referendum campaign. The European Union is an engine driving neoliberalism through Europe and beyond Europe. It's a dysfunctional junior partner to American imperialism, and it's a force, it's a pro-capitalist force in the world, and one that we should challenge and reject. At the core of the European Union is a project to overcome the weakness of European nation states and the small scale of the market for European multinationals by creating a single market and for some countries a single currency shared across the region precisely to bolster the big banks and corporations. That's at the heart of the European project. That's why Margaret Thatcher enthusiastically signed up to the Single European Act in 1985. And the capitalist logic of putting the interests of business before people, profit before people, to turn the Irish slogan on its head, is the only way you can explain the reality of how the Greek people in particular, but many other people in Europe, have suffered on the heel of the Troika, the European institutions and IMF. If you look at Greece, since the economic crisis, under the attentions of the Troika, those living in severe material deprivation has doubled to over a fifth of the population. Greece is facing a calamity on the scale of the crisis of the 1930s. That's what's happening in Greece, and it's echoed across large swathes of southern Europe. Why the suffering in Greece? Because to release the Greek people from the grip of the European Union and the European Central Bank would be to release Greece from the grip of the bankers and the corporations. It would embolden every radical left force across Europe who says we've had enough of austerity, enough of this pressure to cut living standards and so on. It would have unleashed a rebellion against this package of austerity that has reigned across the European Union. That's why the Greek people had every last drop of blood squeezed out of them to defend the banks and the corporations. And this has been happening under the auspices of the Troika. And it's not just in Greece. If you look at France today, remember the rebellion that took place against the labour laws in France. Remember the resistance for generation after generation in France to the attacks on working class people. When Macron came to power in France, he made clear his determination to abide by the EU's deficit reduction rules. What does that mean in practice? It means an automatic reduction of 5 billion euros of cuts to the French budget. Who's going to pay the price for that? Not the French military or anything like that. It will be the public sector and working class people in French society, with the full support of the European Union institutions. I'll say something else just because it's in the news at the moment. The G20 Summit. The G20, people think it's 20 different states. It's 19 states and the European Union. The European Union has a seat in the G20. Who takes up that seat? Two unelected bureaucracies, the European Commission and the European Central Bank. Anyone who thinks that the European Union represents international solidarity, remember that basic fact. Where is international solidarity in Hamburg? Not inside the summit, but on the streets of Hamburg, fighting to shut down the G20 summit. That's real international solidarity. But not only is it undesirable to prop up the European Union institutions, it's completely unfeasible politically in Britain. If you look at public opinion since the referendum, fewer than 1 in 5 people in Britain now want a second referendum in Britain, and only 1 in 10 people want to abandon Brexit altogether. The constituency of people who want to actually reverse Brexit at this stage is very, very small. Now, there's a second version of this argument we also have to reject as a left, and that's the argument of the likes of MP Chuka Umunna, who took the opportunity of the Queen's speech, which should have been a great triumph for Corbyn, to move an amendment calling for continued membership of the European single market. Chuka Umunna knew that he'd lose that vote. He must have known. Only 1 in 6 MPs actually voted for Chuka Umunna's amendment. And if it was a clever plan to split the Tories, it was very unsuccessful because not a single Tory MP actually backed Chuka Umunna's amendment. But I think it's also important to say that it wasn't based on a principled defence of EU migrants, because Chuka Umunna possesses no such principle. Indeed, Chuka Umunna possesses no discernible principles. In September last year, this is what Chuka Umunna argued, you can read it online. If continuation of the free movement, if continuation of the free movement is the price we have to pay for single market membership, then clearly we couldn't remain in a single market. In other words, Chuka Umunna, less than a year ago, put breaking and ending with free movement far ahead of the priority of staying in the single market. We have to understand Chukwuemuna's amendment. This is purely a mechanism to regroup the Labour right and embarrass Jeremy Corbyn and try to bolster their position inside the Labour Party. I'll go further than that and say we are not in favour of retaining membership of any of the institutions closely connected to the single market. That includes the European Economic Area and includes the Customs Union. Now, let me be clear, this is not because we in the Socialist Workers' Party want tariffs. That's not the argument. That's never been historically the argument that the SWP has put. Tariffs tend to destroy more jobs than they defend, and tariffs tend to raise the price of the goods consumed by workers. So we're not broadly in favour of tariffs. We don't want tariff barriers. What we oppose are the rules that are associated with these mechanisms that hamper any genuine socialist project from taking place in Britain. The rules of the European Union today and increasingly are all about imposing impediments to policies such as nationalising the railways and nationalising telecommunications. We don't want the European Union or the single market to pose an obstacle to the kind of progressive measures that Jeremy Corbyn has argued for and the left more broadly has argued for. We have to remove these obstacles. It's not primarily about tariffs and so on. Something else we have to reject is this basic idea, which you get, it's very common in the sort of in the centre and right of the Labour Party, but it sometimes creeps into the left of the Labour Party, this idea of a commonality of interests between big business and working class people. I think we have to reject that logic altogether. You see, I understand where it comes from. It's the idea we create that the business creates jobs and we want jobs and so on and so forth. We have to remember at the heart of this there is a basic and fundamental antagonism between workers and capitalists. We don't defend policies just because they're good for business. If we did that, we'd still be sending children up to sweep chimneys, we'd still be imposing child labour, and we'd still be in favour of executing trade unionists. We don't automatically support things because they're good for business. We understand there's a fundamental class antagonism, and we support policies that favour working class people, even if they conflict with, and especially in some cases, they conflict with the interests of business. And it means, too, that we have to stop talking about soft Brexit and hard Brexit. I think this language is completely unhelpful for us, because what the language of soft and hard Brexit does is this. It binds together the logic of defending free movement with the logic of the single market. And precisely what we want to do is separate the logic of the two things. We defend free movement, we oppose the single market. We want the separation, so we have to break with the logic of soft versus hard Brexit. And the best starting point, in fact, is Corbyn's position, which is to find ways of fighting for a progressive Brexit that favours working class people. I want to spend the next 10 to 15 minutes talking about what that kind of position entails. You see, if the left wants to win, our role in this position, in this situation, is to try to develop a series of radical demands that can be fought for from below through militant methods of struggle that mobilise the broadest possible base of people. And it means that we have to have demands that can establish two kinds of unity. The first kind of unity is we have to fight for unity between the revolutionary left, the Socialist Workers' Party and so on the one hand, and the supporters of Corbyn on the other. It's a basic fact of political life in Britain. It's a basic fact that we now inhabit a world in which we have a mass reformist organisation, a Labour Party over 500,000 people, led by a left-wing reformist leadership. And it means the question of pulling around us Corbynistas, Labour Party members and supporters who share the aims that the Socialist Workers' Party is putting forward in this context is fundamentally important. We want unity between the Corbynistas and the revolutionaries over the kind of demands that we're going to put forwards. The second kind of unity is we have to have a set of demands that can appeal not just to people who supported left exit, which is a minority of the left, but we have to have an appeal to people who supported a left-wing Remain position. There were huge numbers of people in Britain who supported a Remain vote on a basically progressive, left-wing basis, fundamentally to defend freedom of movement and defend European migrants. Those people are our allies. We want to work with them, unite with them, and fight alongside them. So this is why, for us, it's not about gloating. It's about coming up with a set of demands that can advance the struggle involving both groups of people. My appeal to anyone in this room who was a Remain voter but shares the basic line of march for what we say should happen now, do not think that how you voted in that referendum is any kind of barrier to working with the Socialist Workers' Party. We are committed to work alongside you and fight alongside you. It doesn't mean we won't have arguments in the pub afterwards and so on, but we will have to work together over these questions. Now, in many ways, the central issue that we have to fight together over is the question of defending European migrants. For me, this is the most important issue if you talk about the terrain of Brexit. And I think it's important here as well to distance ourselves from the very grim perception of the working class that emerged in the wake of the referendum in some sections of the left. You see, if you look at the view towards EU migrants in particular, 84% of people said they support giving EU migrants the right to remain in Britain in the wake of the referendum, and that includes 77% of Leave voters. The idea that there were going to be masses of Leave voters demanding the expulsion of EU migrants was never an accurate depiction of the mood in British society in the wake of the referendum. Nonetheless, there are arguments, and sadly, even Corbyn has made concessions over the question of free movement, and we have to be clear, we have to be honest, we oppose those concessions. And we oppose those trade union leaders who've echoed those concessions and argued for those concessions. We don't support those concessions at all. But I think it's important to say that in the election campaign, the general election, one of the characteristics of Corbyn's campaign was he refused to make the arguments over migration central to the campaign. He rightly refused to put a cap on overall levels of migration, despite enormous pressure. And his election campaign was in striking distinction to Ed Miliband's, which, if you remember, was giving out mugs, saying on the side of the mug that Britain would impose controls on immigration. Miliband made a virtue of the attacks on immigrants. Corbyn, as much as possible, tried to stand back from that. And what that shows is a very important point. You see, Labour does not need to descend into the gutter to do remarkably far better than Miliband achieved in the election. And in fact, Labour has nothing to gain by playing with the politics of the gutter over the question of migration. And incidentally, if the central issue had been racism in the working class, the general election, Teresa May would have had a landslide given her policies. That simply wasn't the case. The terrain is very different to the way it's depicted. Now, what will happen to EU migrants? I argued at the time of the referendum that there would be a deal on migrants, and there is some kind of deal emerging. Theresa May's generous offer to EU migrants. What's the offer? None of the 3 million EU citizens in Britain before March this year will be asked to leave after Brexit. Good. If they've been in Britain for 5 years, they'll be able to apply for settled status and citizenship a year later. And the rest will be given a grace period of 2 years, after which they'll be able to apply for that status. Good that no one is going to get thrown out of the country. But this offer does not go anything like far enough for us. And we have some very, very clear things to say about what has to happen over this question. Number one, all the EU citizens who are here in Britain have to be given full citizenship rights and shouldn't be treated as second-class citizens. They shouldn't have to apply for ID cards or carry them, fear of being stopped by the police. They shouldn't have to show their passport to get treatment in a hospital. And we should celebrate those members of the Socialist Workers' Party and other people in trade unions who refuse to check people's passports in the hospitals, in the universities and so on. Long may that resistance continue. We working class people are not the border guards for Theresa May, and we should be clear on that question. And we support their right to come and go from Britain to the continent as much as they like and to bring their family... bring their families here to live here as well. These are issues that we can win on. The most poisonous thing for us is if we think we can't win over these demands. We can win over these demands, and we have to fight very, very hard for that. But we have to recognise as well, this is part of a much, much wider battle over the question of racism. The majority of migrants into Britain come from outside the European Union. That's going to continue. Migration is not going to stop, by the way, after the referendum. Most migrants are from outside the European Union, and the British economy is completely dependent, including the welfare state, on migrants to actually run it. That's not going to change. But there are also going to be continued attacks on refugees. Some of them attacks carried through at the moment by the European Union and its ally organisations. We want to fight against them. Continued attacks on Muslims, continued police racism, and attacks on black people. Over all these questions we have to organise and fight. It's a crucial question in British politics, and it's a question we can begin to win on. So the project of building mass anti-racist organisation, particularly Stand Up to Racism, remains a central preoccupation in the period ahead. Secondly, we have to combine fighting racism with a second strand to our approach, which is we have to map out what a progressive exit means for working class people. And one of the central issues we have to raise is that now is a time to break the public sector pay freeze. We have to do this now. It's become a major topic in British political life. And we have to imagine what would it be like if the public sector union said, we're going to defy the trade union laws and we're going to pull every single public sector worker in this country out on strike. The pay freeze will be gone and Theresa May will be gone. That's the reality of the situation. That's one of the things we have to start fighting for today in the unions. We have to hold the union leaders to their pretensions of arguing against this stuff, but there is no way that Theresa May can enforce the anti-union laws given how weak she is at the moment. I'm not going to go through them at length. We produced a document you can get from the party website setting out what a progressive Brexit would look like for the Socialist Workers' Party, and we've printed it in Socialist Worker, but just go through the basics. Popular demands such as £10 an hour minimum wage, decent housing for all as a human right, and a rollout of a programme of council housing, reversal of the privatisations in the National Health Service, the attacks on schools, academisation and so on, scrapping tuition fees and writing off student debt, increased funding for public services, paid for by progressive taxation, and so on and so forth. This kind of agenda, as I say, it chimes with the kind of key measures in the Labour manifesto, but what the election shows is that this kind of agenda for Brexit is hugely popular in British society, and these are all demands we can fight for and mobilise around. And it brings me to the final point I want to make. See, one of the things we have to say to people is we will go out and campaign for a Labour victory if there's a general election again in this country, just as we did in this election. I'm very proud to say the SWP campaigned for a Labour victory. But we have to say, and this is a popular message for the Corbynistas, we're not prepared to wait for a general election to get rid of May. We're not going to wait for May to make our lives worse and the rest of that rabble in Downing Street. We're not going to tolerate a Tory DUP lash-up. We want real change now. And if we want that, it's not good enough to wait for an election. We have to go out now and fight for these demands as part of a broader project of bringing down the government. That's the central thing for us. And it comes back to a very basic argument about the nature of fighting for reforms. The great German-Polish revolutionary, Rosa Luxemburg, said this in 1900. There's two ways of fighting for reforms. There's a way of fighting for reforms from the top down, which says that we elect a left government and that will deliver reforms on our behalf. That's a passive, social democratic, if you like, way of fighting for reforms. But there's another way of fighting for reforms which can be hugely popular among working class people, which is to say we accept nothing, we take for granted nothing from above. We are going to go out and fight from below using militant methods of struggle to win these demands. And in fighting for these reforms, this is Luxemburg's argument, we increase the confidence, the combativity and the organisation of working class people. It puts us in a better position to prevent those reforms being taken away and to deepen the struggles to win further demands in the future. That's a revolutionary way of fighting for reforms, and that has to be the method that we apply. And part of the reason this is so important is that I think there will be an election quite soon in Britain, and I think Corbyn will probably win it. But don't think for a moment that Corbyn is going to have any more of an easy ride than the Syriza government elected a couple of years ago in Greece had. The ruling class is no more gentle, peaceful and pleasant than the Greek ruling class. And we have to remember the enormous pressure from within the state, from European capital, and from within the Greek capitalist class itself, brought to bear on the Syriza government to force it to capitulate to the interests of capital. Enormous pressure will be brought to bear on the Labour government. We have to remember, though, this too. It was not inevitable that the struggle in Greece went down to defeat. What would it have taken to have won in Greece? A break with the euro, a break with the European institutions, taking over the Greek banks, beginning to organise from the bottom of society, but also crucially this, beginning to impose a new direction on society by taking over workplaces, taking over the supermarkets, taking over food production, reorganising the economy from the bottom upwards to meet the needs of working class people. It was something that was taken off the table by Tsipras and Varoufakis. We need to say that that option of mass struggle from below, pointing in a socialist direction, has to be part of the agenda for how we would fight to defend a Corbyn government and how we would deepen and enhance the struggle for socialism under Corbyn. That requires independent socialist organisation in every workplace, in every community, that can begin to coordinate those struggles, drive the struggles forwards, and impose a direction on those struggles. That's why the Socialist Workers' Party exists. I would love to see a Corbyn victory, but if we're going to take that victory forwards and a march towards a process which ends this rotten, barbaric, profit-driven system, we have to go further. And if we want to go further, we must have independent socialist organisation, not wedded to running the capitalist system, but committed ultimately to breaking with and defying the capitalist system. A movement committed to struggle from below. The great socialist James Connolly once said, "The only true prophets are those who carve out the future which they announce." Join us and help carve out that future. Thank you.
Right, John Molyneux from Dublin. Always nice to follow on the great quote from James Connolly. Right, I just want to say a word about the question of the EU from outside the Brexit context, from a wider context. Yeah? Okay. I think that capitalism has entered a period of decay, not its final crisis. It's not about to collapse, but it is seriously decomposing. And that is going to continue because of the underlying declining rate of profit, on which Joseph has written eloquently, and because it's careering towards climate change at the same time. And in this situation, I believe that the more the centre fails to hold, the more there is polarisation to the right and the left, the more the EU and other institutions like it are going to break up in this process. So, in other words, the question of Brexit and Britain is not an isolated phenomenon. Just consider, if in Ireland, right, in 2011, after the economic crash and the bank crisis and so on, the dominant capitalist party was massively defeated. That was Fianna Fáil. They were wiped out. And they were replaced, unfortunately, with a coalition between Fine Gael and Labour. Labour, who had campaigned on the slogan, "It's Labour's way or Frankfurt's way," which they promptly abandoned. But let's imagine that a government had not been elected, but you'd had a left government elected, of any shape or form. Who would it have come into conflict with immediately? Immediately it would have come into conflict with the EU. Even the Fine Gael Labour government found itself disciplined by the EU and forced to impose austerity on the Irish people. If they tried to do anything different, the EU would have been down on them like a ton of bricks. Imagine in Spain, Podemos wins the election. Who will be the first people saying that you cannot implement your program, we won't let you, it will be the EU. The more there is revolt, the more it will come into conflict with the EU. The question, therefore, right, those trying to cling to the EU, in my opinion, are like people trying to cling to the Titanic when it's breaking up and sinking. The real question is, what places the EU? Are we going to replace it from the right with harder borders, concentration camps, letting repelling refugees and so on, or are we going to replace it from the left with workers' solidarity and internationalism? That's the real question that I'm facing.
Thanks, Joseph. I think it might be worth just reminding ourselves why we in the SWP took the position that we did of Lexit, and I'm just going to sort of like remind myself as well. Firstly was because if Brexit did happen, Cameron would go. And Cameron did go. He'd even survived 24 hours after the referendum result. So I think, we can sort of pat ourselves in the back a bit over that, and I think that's a good thing. Secondly, because we're against racism. And the racism that we've seen in the Mediterranean Sea with the death of migrants coming from outside the EU seeking to arrive in the EU. The EU has blood on its hands and they are murderers. And we should have no truck with murderers. And they're also murderers in relation to austerity, particularly in relation to Greece, where we have seen, haven't we, that the health of ordinary Greek people has suffered and been decimated through cuts in healthcare and other welfare provision as a result of austerity and the actions of the Troika, including the EU. I suppose moving forward, I've just got a couple of questions for Joseph. Firstly, I'm following on from John, in the Irish context, given given that we are now moving in a Brexit period, where does that leave the Good Friday Agreement? Because there is concern that Brexit will basically unravel the Good Friday Agreement. And secondly, related to that, where does that leave the Irish Northern Ireland border? Because that has also become an issue, particularly complicated now that the scum of the DUP have formed a pact with the scum of the Tories.
Just in terms of the demands we should be putting forward for social justice, I think in terms of austerity, I think one specific programme we should be putting forward is basically to smash universal credit and stop the benefit sanctions. Corbyn mentioned in his campaign that people sleeping rough in the streets next to train stations, which is underestimation. People are sleeping rough every 10-15 metres in all our town centres and city centres. It's a direct consequence of the Tories' sanctions regimes. It's a deliberate policy to grind down and kill unproductive plebs, and I think the party should be making more of a play on it and raising the issue. They're looking for any excuse to people miss appointment by 5 minutes, they have a job interview, a whole range of nefarious excuses which they're looking forward to grind people down and kill people. The most infamous example being of David Clapson, a veteran soldier in his 50s, worked all his life. He ended up, he died 10 days after his sanction was imposed. The reason why he died, he didn't have enough money to put in his for his electric meter, and his fridge failed, and then because he's a diabetic, hence his death. He had £3 in his account. I think it's more of a central issue the party should be raising. It affects all working class communities. We don't reject the Tory narrative. It's that the unemployed are to blame for being unemployed. It's not the unemployed. There's no jobs there. There's not enough jobs to provide for people. It's the parasites are the bankers at the top. We need to be more proactive on opposing universal credit and fighting benefit sanctions and just take them on.
I worry that the left is absent from the debate around Brexit. I think it's widely seen as a debate on the right between two sets of wrong answers, and we're not very interested in it. And it's very complicated, and it runs from these weird trade deals to bull seamen, and we haven't really got a view on it. And I think there's large bits of the working class movement that essentially gives into that. And it's very, very important that we recognise that the debate is going to be not just about the detail of Brexit, it's going to be about what sort of society we want to live in. And that's why it is entirely reasonable to raise within it not just the specifics of Brexit, which we have to do about EU nationals' rights, about trade deals, about the continuation of Ttip or whatever it may be, but to say we also have to put it in the context of demands like an end to the NHS cuts, a £10 an hour minimum wage for all now, regardless of age, and so on. Only by doing that, I think, can we shape it in a way that has mass appeal. And just one that I think we should add to it, I don't think this is in R1 at the moment, but I think we should add to it the question of a Europe without nuclear weapons and without American bases and an end to NATO. I think this is another important element that we ought to stress inside it as actually part of our recognition of the sort of society in which we want to live. Now, I have to say, there is not going to be universal agreement on the left around the sorts of demands that Joseph put forward. Even if I think of the forces that were part of the left exit, Lexit campaign, the question of freedom of movement, for example, is one in which I think almost none of the forces in that campaign agree with us about, because they swallow the trade union leaders, or most of the trade union leaders' argument that migration, whether we like it or not, does reduce wages, and therefore something has to be done about it. That doesn't mean that we should row back on that argument. It's an extremely important part of the argument that we say there is no reason why withdrawal from the European Union should reduce the rights of migrants and refugees. Indeed, it's an opportunity to first defend freedom of movement as it presently exists, and to go further than it, and to go further to remove the fake offer of freedom of movement inside the European Union to one that really means freedom of movement. And I think it's very important that groups like the 3 million, for example, that campaign for the rights of EU nationals, and those who want to continue fighting for freedom of movement, actually we, who were on the Leave side, are much more the friends of fighting over those issues than those who said they were voting for it for Remain in terms of the official bodies. And I think it's very important we keep up that argument.
Comrades, I have no problem with the arguments about Brexit and the reason that you want to leave. The problem that we have as English nationals living in other countries other than the UK is what is going to happen to things like benefits, pensions, all sorts of things, where we may have accumulated pension rights inside the UK and then moved abroad, as they say, and living in another country. There are all sorts of things that are coming out of the woodwork about what May wants to do with pensions and benefits, child benefit, all sorts of things that they're trying to wrap up. And this is an area that I don't think we have discussed in any detail inside the party. I think it is important. There are something like 1.5, 2 million of us living outside the UK. I've retired, I'm not going to be affected. I've no child benefit to worry about, and my pension is secure. But for people who are younger than myself, there is a problem, and we do need to address these questions. Thank you for your time.
In the Irish SWP, we took the same position, obviously, as our sister party in Britain, for the same reasons, both the principled reason that as you said yourself, Comrade, that the EU is a neoliberal hellhole that attacks migrants, and also the tactical reason that we saw, the same as you did, that this would destabilise British imperialism and open up spaces and so on. So that was fine, but it did have, there was other layers of complexity, obviously in terms of where you were, and people are aware that in the north 56% voted to remain, and so that's one issue. And the other issue has obviously been the resurgence of nationalism, because what Sinn Féin have tried to do is use the Brexit issue as a way of galvanising support for a united Ireland, saying you can't drag one part of Ireland out of the EU and leave the other part in. So I think what has saved us in this, because we've been under major attack, for example, give one specific example of an attack all over West Belfast, which is the heart of the provisional IRA, massive posters saying hard border, Brexit, brought to you by people before profit, the DUP and the Tories. Thousands of posters, well, not thousands, but hundreds of posters all over the place. So what saved us, I think, has been two things. We have been squeezed, but we have remained, that we've held on. I think we've held on for two reasons. One is political clarity, as we've heard from Joseph. And what we say is, when they say things like, we need a united Ireland, we say, what kind of united Ireland? Do we want a United Ireland where the horrible northern sectarian state is latched on to a horrible tax haven southern state where you drive down corporation taxes, drive down rights for everybody and drag? And will that really appeal to workers, Protestant workers in the north, when 96% of the schools in the south are run by the Catholic Church? So what we say is you have to end you have to drag down two failed states on both sides of the borders, and that's the kind of Ireland that everybody would want to fight for. So we have key demands, like we said: end the cuts in the public services, make sure that we don't have corporation tax cuts on the back of this. So I think the political clarity that we've been able to bring has helped us. And the other thing I think that has helped us is our roots in the communities. I've been saying this in other meetings. I think it's really important that when we came under serious pressure, people knew us because we'd been round the doors, we talked to people, library cuts, all sorts of cuts that we'd been involved in. In other words, people knew, and we could actually make an argument because we had those roots. So I think the revolutionary left, we have to now get really serious. We have those roots. We're very proud of what our comrades here are doing. And I would say, if you haven't joined the SWP here, get involved.
Thank you. What's the position on the European Court of Justice, human rights, workers' rights, environmental standards?
Thank you. There was a comrade there. Did you still want to speak?
The conversation's moved on, but I just want to make a quick point about the weakness of Teresa May, really. I wasn't here yesterday because I was at the Godiva Festival in Coventry. It was the biggest free festival in Europe. If it doesn't clash with Marxism, get yourself along there next year. But Jeremy Corbyn was a big theme. A couple of the bands mentioned it. Several bands played Seven Nation Army so everybody could sing along. And at the end of of last night, a lot of young people were singing, "Oh, Jeremy Corbyn," and of course I couldn't walk away from that. I had to join in. And then a couple of people roughly my age, maybe a year or two younger, maybe in the late 30s or something, didn't like what we were seeing, F off, and then another brother, "Whoa, Maggie Thatcher." I thought, well, wow, isn't that amazing that somebody who hates Corbyn, who is a Tory, cannot even bring himself to mention the name of the Tory leader at this point in time? If she can't even win those people, what's she going to win in Brussels?
Hello? All right, so I apologize if I missed this in the beginning, if you addressed this, and I think you addressed it somewhat. I, towards the end, ended up settling on Remain because the narrative, as I saw it, the dominant narrative within the political class and within the mainstream press was, I found, quite reactionary, quite racist. And I felt that given the nature of a very right-wing, perhaps the most right-wing government in power at the time, being in charge, that wouldn't be overall good. The vote's in, so that's fine. So I think sometimes it's easy for some people to forget, because I heard this now about the European Union, how the European Union is responsible for the deaths of thousands of migrants. But the European Union is also a sum of its member states, and the reason the European Union imposes austerity and neoliberalism is because the member states are neoliberal states. And the reason the European Union is vicious and savage towards migrants is because the member states and the governments of the member states are vicious and savage towards migrants. It's not like Theresa May's government was desperately fighting for the rights of migrants, but that evil European institution just wouldn't allow a better treatment of refugees. So I think that's fundamentally important to bear in mind, that the idea that just because we leave, that means that these shackles of capital won't be necessarily as powerful. There were benefits to being in the EU, and as someone who works in human rights, the fact that they want to scrap the Human Rights Act and we don't have an entrenched constitution here is worrying to me. So maybe if you could address some of that.
I'm on the national executive of the University and Colleges Union, and one of the arguments that's we've been having in my union, one of the problems of being elected to the NEC as a comrade of any trade union is that you have to spend your time arguing with people who are very much part of the trade union bureaucracy in this country and who articulate a view about Europe which has permeated down in terms of a lot of the working class, in terms of the arguments that you hear in The Guardian. The last two comrades who made some very interesting and useful contributions about really where a lot of people were about a year ago, and still are, many people are still are. And I think we have to ask ourselves the question, what is the guarantor in terms of rights in this country? Is it the European Court of Justice? Or is it the struggle in this country to defend rights? You see, there are two conceptions of where rights come from, which I think are in contradiction to some extent at this juncture. When we talk about a European system starting to fragment, what you see is contradictory interpretations of those rights. I'll give you an example. In Britain, the Cameron government introduced a Trade Union Act. The Trade Union Act contradicts the International Labour Conventions. It could be contradicted by a judgment at the European Court of Justice. The only thing is, where is that judgment? And where is the impact in terms of the British state abandoning the Trade Union Act? And what is the most likely route to smashing the Trade Union Act? Is it a judgment in the European Court, or is it a mass strike that drives a coach and horses through the Trade Union Act by saying, sod your act, we're going out on strike, we don't care about 50%, we don't care about 20%, we've got a majority, we're out the door, we make the profits, and you can just go and whistle. In other words, the working class can take militant industrial action and smash those acts. And the reason why that's not a pipe dream is because this working class in this country has got a long history of smashing acts like the Trade Union Act. Just like just with the Heath, just with Barbara Castle in place of strife, and all of that in the 70s, we have to relearn that lesson. And the problem in the trade union movement is that they look to Europe because they don't want to mobilise their members in Britain, because they are reformists. And this is the struggle that we're engaged in. And therefore, the real question, I think, is thrown up, is that if you're a revolutionary, you say that workers' power, workers' struggle is the answer. That it is workers combining together. So we don't look for somebody else to fight our battles for us. And that means that we have to be the champions of the freedoms that we defend. In our workplaces, we have to make the argument for solidarity internationally. We have to remember those lessons, and we have to make the arguments for solidarity within the British state. When workers take strike action, we need to organise, we need to mobilise, and we need to smash their trade union laws, and we need to demonstrate in practice that we are the best defenders of the rights that we hold in this country, because nobody else is going to fight for us, whether it's in Europe or whether it's in the government or wherever. What will push Labour to the left, what will force Labour to hold behind Corbyn, will be the movement from the ground up, not from the top down.
Myself from the Irish SWP, but just around the issue of the EU granting rights, just I want to point out that Ireland joined the EU, I think it was 1973, either 73 or 74. Being a gay man in Ireland was a criminal offence until 1993. Just a few weeks ago, the Irish state sectioned a teenage girl under the Mental Health Act to prevent her from having an abortion. Divorce was illegal in Ireland until 1995. So, I do not think the EU, we joined the EU and we automatically got these rights. There was an ECHR ruling. The ECHR ruling over, and the ECHR, by the way, is separate from the EU, but the ECHR ruling around homosexuality was voted, the implementation of that ruling was voted against by the state in 1987. It was only voted in favour of in 1993 after a massive wave of abortion protests in 1992, combined with a plethora of allegations of horrific sexual abuse against the Catholic Church, broke the hold of the reactionary Catholic Church. It was not, these were not granted from above. These rights were won by working class people campaigning hard for them. Last year we got the right to equal marriage. That did not come from the EU. What that came from, I was part of that campaign. There was times in my area in Ballyfermot, in a really working class area in Ballyfermot, where the most difficult thing about the canvass was we had too many canvassers. We actually couldn't cope with the amount of volunteers, young working class volunteers that we had working on that campaign. I think the idea that these kind of rights were given on high from the EU, quite frankly, for people like me on the ground and people like, the people I'm seeing in front of us, it's a little bit of an insult because it actually kind of downgrades the work that people, like the people in the room, have done to win these rights.
Let me try to answer some of the questions. The comrades in Ireland are absolutely right. I mean, in terms of what people before profit argue, they can argue that we don't want two dysfunctional states, north and south of the border. We need to fight for a socialist agenda for unification. I think for those of us in Britain, the argument is much, much more simple. And it's one of the arguments, again, I should have mentioned it. It's one of our demands that we make. All those people who say we don't want a hard border between Northern Ireland and the EU, the answer is very simple. Give a referendum to all those people across the island of Ireland on reunification. Let's solve the problem once and for all. So we have to take a very clear and principled position on these questions. Secondly, people mentioned NATO, and again, it's an indictment of the European Union. Not only has NATO accompanied the European Union at every stage of its push eastwards into the former Eastern Bloc countries, but if you look at who it was who was repelling refugees in the Aegean Sea, it's a NATO fleet that's doing it. And the reality is that the European Union is bound hand and foot together with NATO. It's part of the reason for our opposition to it. And it's part of the reason why Donald Trump is an exception. Every other US president, including Obama, has been a vocal defender of the European Union, seeing it as a junior partner to American imperialism, policing global capitalism. The blow struck against the European Union is also a blow against NATO, and it's a blow against the imperial world order. The third point I want to make, Comrade asked about securing rights for British citizens in the EU. I think this is very simple. The best way to secure rights for British citizens in the EU is to secure full rights for EU citizens in Britain. That's what we have to argue for. We have to focus on the rights of EU citizens, because anything we achieve here will almost certainly be rolled out across the European Union. The fourth point, about laws and standards and so on. I agree with the comrade who spoke last, and we have to be clear that the fundamental rights we've achieved in Britain have been achieved through centuries of struggle. Let's not forget that. But in terms of the rights that have been secured, you see, first of all, on environmental legislation, the first thing that will happen is all EU law will be written into British law. This is what it's not called the Great Repeal Bill. They had to take great out of it. You're not allowed to have adjectives in bills. Do people know that? I think they're written on goat skin or something, and you can't have adjectives. It's very... You find very arcane things out about the British state when you start looking into it in any depth. The repeal bill supposedly will write British EU law into British law. What we have to argue for, first and foremost, is no watering down of the protections that have been written into EU law. There's the threat that's been dangled over us of, what's it called, the Henry VIII clauses, where ministers can essentially change laws by fiat without any vote in Parliament. Corbyn's answer to this was fantastic. Henry VIII wasn't exactly a Democrat, was he? And we have to argue that. No watering down, and we have to push, obviously, to strengthen the protections of the environment. We have to avoid confusion about the European Court of Justice. The European Court of Justice is not a court that defends human rights. The European Court of Justice is a court that defends the implementation of EU legislation, including single market legislation, the freedoms of capital and so on. The European Court of Human Rights is a different body to the European Court of Justice, and it's linked to the Council of Europe, of which Britain remains a member. And unless Britain breaks with the Council of Europe, which is a much bigger body than the European Union, it's unlikely we'll break with the European Court of Human Rights. Theresa May said she wanted to do this at one point. Whether she's confident enough to do it in the current situation is another question entirely. But of course we have to fight to defend our human rights. But it's a separate battle to the battle for breaking with the European Union. A couple of longer, slightly more detailed points. The first one is, someone said that the European Union is just the sum of its states. There's a strong element of truth to that. If you look at the haggling over EU policy between Germany, France, Italy, and so on, it's true that many of the key decisions are made by different nation states of Europe. The European Union hasn't transcended national divisions across the EU. This is why there are constantly fights between national governments within the European Union. But it's not just a collection of states. You see, the European Union also creates internally its own pure pro-capitalist institutions. The European Central Bank is a key one. It's part of a series of institutions policing European capital. Yeah. It creates the European Commission, an unelected body about dictating the laws that will apply across Europe and shoring up European capitalism. Frontex, the European border force that works with NATO to repel refugees, is a European-wide body. So yes, it's a collection of nation states, but it also creates pro-capitalist institutions that act as a last line of defence for European capitalism when it comes under threat, as comrades have spoken so well about. And because there's this sort of supposedly cosmopolitan, friendly internationalist side of the European Union, people say things about it that they wouldn't say about any similar body. You see, people would never say about the World Trade Organization or the IMF, it's just a collection of states, or it's about internationalism and so on and so forth. One of the arguments we have to begin to develop in the left is the idea that the European Union is an institution like the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, and so on, that polices world capitalism, and therefore we welcome these bodies being broken up. And in the case of the EU, the only way you can break it up is by states leaving it, and Britain has begun that process. Now, the final points I want to make are these. John Molyneux says, rightly, that there will be more of this in the future. I believe that this will not be the last blow struck against the European Union. It's also true, as many people on the left point out, that some of these blows are not struck by the radical left. There are blows struck against the institutions of mainstream capitalism from both the radical left and the radical right. That's true. How do we resolve that situation? We can't solve that problem by being seen as the people who prop up the institutions of mainstream capital and mainstream politics across Europe. We have to be the radical critics, the socialist critics of these institutions, or we have nothing to say in these crises where millions upon millions of people are disillusioned. Why did working class people not vote for membership of the EU? Because what has the European Union done for working class people in a country where 1 million people are dependent on food banks, where millions of children go to sleep in poverty? Millions of working class people looked around and said, what has the EU done for us? Now, are we going to say, no, you must support these institutions because the alternative is even worse? Or are we going to say, we share your discontent, we also want to break up these institutions, but we want to lead the resistance in a left-wing direction? That has to be our argument. And let me finish by saying this. I believe that the totality of what's happened over the last year marks a new political situation that's emerging. Never before, certainly in my lifetime, which is longer than you might think, never before, in the time I've been politically active, have the structures of capitalism seemed so crisis-prone, so filled with turmoil and chaos and disorder. And never before in Britain has socialism been such a popular idea. I remember anti-capitalist movements, anti-war movements, and so on. I remember all that. But when was the last time a politician became so wildly popular that people would sing his name at Glastonbury arguing for socialism? That's a tremendous cultural shift that's taken place in Britain over a matter of months and years. Socialism has suddenly become a popular idea. What we have to begin arguing now is, first of all, we want to work to promote that socialism, but secondly, we have to have an argument about what we mean by socialism. And socialism, for me, is about establishing a very simple principle. It's a simple principle that working class people, through their own struggles from below, can liberate themselves from the hold of capitalism, and in doing so, liberate the whole of society. It's the basic premise of socialism, of Marxism, and it's why the Socialist Workers' Party are here. If you've come to Marxism, if you've listened to the meetings, and if you support what we're saying about the problems with capitalism, and you support the idea that working class people, these degraded, ridiculed people in society, are in fact the source of hope, that we can liberate ourselves from capitalism, and in doing so liberate the world, I would urge you today, join us and join that struggle. Thank you.